Cantonese participants hear the interpreter? If so, please give us an emoji or a thumbs up so that we know that you can hear the interpretation. Okay, if we're all set, I wish everybody a great meeting. I'm getting some thumbs up. So you can go ahead and assign me as interpreter in a second, and I'll pass it to Molly and Kung.
Thank you, Marianela. Thank you, Andreina. Thank you, Kai. Thank you, Tammy. This is the incredible work of making sure that our movement is really for everyone. So thank you for the language justice crew here. I'm Kong. I'm the director of Jobs with Justice San Francisco, a labor and community coalition that is about bringing together workers, families, tenants, because we're all part of building working class power. And we're here together on a lonely land, and we're co-hosting this event with the San Francisco Anti-Displacement Coalition. And just, you know, I have been anticipating this event for weeks. Like, I've just been that kid in the back seat being, are we there yet? Are we there yet? So I'm really, really glad to see all the people here on Zoom. And please, I see people already introducing themselves in the chat, folks from La Colectiva, folks from tenants unions across the country. So please say hello, drop your name in the chat, from where you're from, who you're with. And I'm really excited to be here with the strikers, right? That anticipation, I've been inspired by this organizing for the past several months. And in fact, the whole past few years, when I learned that tenants in San Francisco are taking on the largest corporate landlord here, right? And so I'm inspired here to be with Juana May and Maria Torice from the Veritas Tenants Association, who took part in the successful 5-month debt strike, right? And I'm also here with Jane McAlevey from the UC Berkeley Labor Center, who's a labor scholar and organizer I've looked up to for years. Astra Taylor, who's been the founder of the Debt Collective, which is just inspiring work right now across the country. And Carmen Lee of AFME 3299, the statewide union of UC employees. So please introduce yourselves, and well, in the chat, there's so many incredible organizers, tenants, worker leaders, because this is a victory that really belongs to all of us across the country. So I'll turn it over to Molly and the strikers to tell us more about the big win.
Thanks, Kung. Hi, I'm Molly Goldberg. I'm the director of the San Francisco Anti-Displacement Coalition. We're made up of dozens of different tenant rights groups here in San Francisco, and I'm so excited to be here tonight to celebrate the Veritas Tenants Association and their recent victory. And before I hand it over to Juana and Maria to share their story about the strike, I want to offer a little bit of context for why their debt strike and their win is so important right now, and why we need victories like theirs in our movement. It's been a humbling couple of years for many of us in the tenant movement. At the beginning of the pandemic, I think we all felt pretty powerful, actually. In San Francisco, we had an eviction moratorium in place before the local shelter-in-place order even took effect. And by the end of April 2020, we advocated for and won a nearly universal ban on evictions and rent increases, and everywhere you went, people were talking about canceling rent and rent strikes. But that initial energy and that sort of spontaneous energy around things like canceling rent didn't magically translate to the power we needed to win the real rent cancellation and ongoing stability for our communities. And as time went on, we saw the debt piling up, right? People couldn't get evicted for their rent debt, but the debt was still there, and it was growing to this unimaginable scale. And so locally we said, okay, all right, let's do something about it. Let's try to figure out a way to get the debt canceled. And we worked with Jobs with Justice and many other groups here to pass a tax on sales of big real estate transactions to raise money for this debt relief and also for social housing. And people said, you can't win that. This isn't the right time. But we did. We won big, and we started dreaming up a program that forgave debt at the community level and bailed out small landlords first. We felt really proud. We felt really powerful. But around this time, the state of California also stepped in and passed their own eviction moratorium that preempted our local one. So our local one wasn't in effect anymore. And this was the beginning of the narrowing from these big universal community level protections that we had initially been able to win to these more individualized ones. There were a lot of notification requirements and other loopholes for people to slip through, and a lot of people started falling through the cracks. And a lot of the member groups of SFADC became overwhelmed with trying to keep up and provide that individualized support to people. And not long after that, the federal government funded this big rent relief program that many of us on here today, I'm sure, saw as both a necessary intervention in the growing debt crisis and also a cleverly disguised real estate industry bailout. And much of our work since then has been dominated by helping thousands and thousands of individuals just in San Francisco alone navigate an inaccessible, bureaucratic, constantly changing rent relief system as our primary tool to keep people housed. And that is the context where VTA said, we're not willing to accept these piecemeal solutions. We're not willing to leave one another behind. We aren't willing to accept a system that bails out big real estate yet again, but is indifferent to whether we stay in our homes. And because the VTA already had the experience of fighting together for years through building this tenants association, they knew they had the power to do that. And so even before their win, their ability to imagine a different way to keep the door open to these collective interventions has been so inspiring. And this win, this is another example of the VTA showing us the power of organizing to win better for our movement and win bigger. So with that, I want to turn it over to Juana and Maria to share their story of the debt strike and how they won this important victory. I'll hand it to you, Juana and Maria. And we just have to unmute you first. Perfect.
Hola a todos, bienvenidos a este evento esta noche. Estamos muy emocionadas de compartir esta victoria con ustedes.
Hola, buenas noches. Mi nombre es Juana May. Yo soy una miembro de la Asociación de Inquilinos. Participé en la huelga.
Bueno, mi nombre es María Toriche y yo también soy miembro de la Asociación de Inquilinos de Veritas. Yo también participé en la huelga junto con Juana y decenas de inquilinos. Juana y yo tomaremos unos minutos ahora para contar la historia de la huelga y un poco más sobre nuestra asociación. La historia de la huelga fue la historia de nosotros.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Perdóneme por interrumpir. No me habían agregado todavía al canal de interpretación cuando íbamos a hacer el cambio con Andreina. Entonces, hi, I wasn't added to the interpretation channel before we switched with Andreina. Could I please be added? Y para mientras, Andreina, no sé si quiere. Okay, they're adding me, me están agregando.
Okay, I think we should be all set. Thanks for waiting.
Bueno, Juana y yo nos tomaremos unos minutos ahora para contar la historia de nuestra huelga y un poco más sobre nuestra asociación. La historia de la huelga fue la historia de nosotros, aprendiendo a usar nuestro poder como inquilinos en deuda. Cuando perdí mi trabajo en un restaurante, al comienzo de la pandemia sentí miedo, aislamiento y depresión. Aunque muchas personas perdieron sus trabajos, yo no participé en algo junto con ellos. A través de este golpe aprendí a usar mi poder.
Antes de unirme a la asociación, El año pasado no sabía nada de mi alrededor. Aprendí hablando con los inquilinos y que estaban en la asociación y vivían en otros edificios. Todo lo que sabía antes era que el letrero fuera del edificio había cambiado de una campaña a otra.
Yo tampoco sabía mucho sobre Veritas y tampoco sabía mucho sobre mi asociación de inquilinos. De Veritas se ha estado organizando en San Francisco durante aproximadamente 4 años. Nuestro enfoque es organizar cada edificio con una mayoría de inquilinos. Luego los inquilinos de cada edificio deciden sus representantes en la asociación de la ciudad. La huelga no es nuestra primera campaña. Muchos trabajos se ha hecho antes por otros inquilinos que no sea yo para llegar a este punto.
Debido a que Veritas ha comprado edificios en Oakland, Alameda y Los Ángeles, VTA también se ha convertido en un sindicato de inquilinos en todo el estado.
Una gran parte de esta historia es el programa de alivio de alquiler del estado. Cuando me enteré del programa de alivio de alquiler, supe que podía presentar una solicitud por mi cuenta. Todos los huelguistas lo hicieron. Hablamos mucho de eso. Sabíamos que cada uno de nosotros podía presentar una solicitud y potencialmente obtener cobertura. Pero el programa no me enseñó nada sobre mi poder y eso es lo más importante en estos momentos, en esta crisis.
Realizamos reuniones mensuales de huelga. Las reuniones fueron en inglés y en español y la gente vino por Zoom, por teléfono y en persona. La huelga comenzó en septiembre, antes de que terminara la moratoria de California. La huelga comenzó con aproximadamente el 25% de los inquilinos de Veritas con deuda de alquiler. En aplicar, teníamos una meta interna de mantener al menos el 15% en huelga, que eran unos 50 inquilinos.
La huelga fue una forma de construir nuestro sindicato y aprender sobre nuestro poder. No iba a aprender nada acerca de mi poder como inquilino, presentando una solicitud por mi cuenta y esperando lo mejor. De hecho, sentí mi seguridad al estar con mis vecinos juntos. Durante el transcurso de la huelga, hicimos una desobediencia civil en septiembre. Nos sentamos en el vestíbulo de la sede de Veritas y nos negamos a irnos. Un organizador del sindicato de trabajadores 8299 estaba ahí con nosotros apoyándonos y también estaba una pastora. Lo haría todo de nuevo y fue muy inspirador para mí estar en este momento.
Hemos aprendido a través de esta huelga que nosotros como inquilinos debemos reconocer que el gobierno no nos salvará. Nos salvamos cuando vimos que el gobierno se estaba quedando sin dinero y los grandes terratenientes se estaban aprovechando de planearnos por lo que necesitábamos y que el gobierno no iba a obligar a Veritas a cubrir ninguna deuda.
En octubre, después de la desobediencia civil, Veritas envió un correo electrónico diciéndonos que si el Estado no cubría el 100% de la deuda, entonces tendríamos que pagar el resto. También emitieron su primera amenaza de acciones legales contra los huelguistas. Esto era inexplicable para nosotros y respondimos con una conferencia de prensa denunciando las amenazas. Menos de dos meses después, Veritas hizo concesiones significativas. Primero acordaron cancelar toda la deuda restante para los inquilinos que presenten solicitudes y el gobierno no cubre todo. En segundo lugar, se comprometieron a hablar con nosotros sobre la deuda sombra, yo no tenía idea de lo que era. Y resultó un tercer problema que se convirtieron a no aumentar los alquileres para este año.
Pasamos mucho tiempo antes del paro visitando edificios en varios con muchos inquilinos que se quedaron sin trabajo, varios como el Distrito de la Misión y el Tenderloin. No teníamos una lista de esos inquilinos, así que tuvimos que construirla desde cero. No encontramos a todos. Veritas dijo que había alrededor de 330, pero encontramos cerca de un tercio y pasamos si podemos lograr que el 25% esté en huelga. Eso podría ser suficiente para obligar a Veritas a hacer algunas concesiones.
También hay que decir que la huelga solo pudo involucrar a inquilinos de decenas de edificios de toda la ciudad, porque llevamos tiempo organizando la asociación de edificio en edificio. No fue una mayoría y me pregunto qué podremos lograr cuando la mayoría de los inquilinos de Veritas se declaren en huelga. Tampoco he oído hablar de otros inquilinos en California que hayan hecho ese tipo de huelga de deuda. ¿Qué pasaría si más de nosotros lo hiciéramos y trabajáramos juntos haciéndolo también? Otra vez, como esta ocasión, la huelga, ¿verdad?
Pensando en retrospectiva, creo que era nuestro trabajo como inquilinos ver las brechas en lo que el gobierno estaba ofreciendo y ver dónde teníamos la capacidad de elegir algo diferente de nuestro propietario. Todos se aprovecharon y aceptar el trato, incluido algunos miembros de BTA, y entiendo que no todos tienen una asociación de inquilinos o algo así, pero deberíamos preguntarnos qué podemos hacer ahora para usar esta deuda para obtener un mejor trato, ya sea del propietario o del gobierno. Teníamos que probar algo y teníamos que averiguar dónde podría estar nuestro poder.
Lo que fue un desafío fue que los políticos locales no nos apoyaran públicamente. Pensaron que era demasiado arriesgado. Pensaron que no sabían. Y creo que sigue siendo difícil para la gente entender que la deuda podría ser una fuente de poder.
Otra cosa que teníamos que darnos cuenta era cómo estábamos negociando. Queríamos una gran reunión abierta para negociar. Veritas se negó a reunirse en absoluto, pero luego nos dimos cuenta de que estábamos negociando públicamente un negocio al siguiente y necesitábamos entender eso para tomar una decisión inteligente cada mes durante la votación de la huelga. Durante todo el proceso usamos fotos y peticiones en papel para mantener la participación de los inquilinos.
Finalmente, parte de nuestro objetivo desde el principio fue tener una campaña para una nueva ley para la organización de inquilinos, al mismo tiempo que la huelga, pensando que la huelga ayudaría a fortalecer la ley y demostraría la necesidad de legislación para crear un marco legal para la negociación colectiva de los inquilinos en San Francisco. Creo que teníamos razón. Ayer, la Junta de Supervisores votó unánimemente para aprobar la ley, convirtiendo a San Francisco en la primera ciudad del país con una ley sobre negociación colectiva para inquilinos.
Bueno, gracias por todo tu apoyo. Nos detendremos ahora para que también podamos escuchar a Jane, Astra y Carmen.
Thank you, Maria and Juana. Wow, what an amazing story and amazing work. And, you know, just Maria, Juana, all the others, they put their homes on the line, right? They put their lives on the line. They took an incredible risk, and they didn't do it just by themselves. They organized and brought others with them, and they stood together and they won. So can we just clap it up, like show your love, big 10, big 10, you know, yeah, that's right. I love it. I love it. You know, and you can drop in your chat, you know, shout it out to them, you know, shout out their courage, their tenacity, their fighting spirit. Yeah, that's right. Who here is inspired, right? If you want to add in your chat, you know, anything that you found particularly exciting, share that with folks. You know, while this happened with one big corporate landlord and one fight in San Francisco, this fight goes just way beyond that, right? This is why you are all here. This is an amazing array of people on this call, right? Because debt is a tenant issue, it's a student issue, it's a family and health issue, it's a worker issue. But what we're learning from Maria and Juana is it's not just an issue, but it's leverage, right? And just like our labor, the work that we do to produce value, it can also be a source of power if we organize. And so we have a broad group of panelists here tonight, because whether it's in your home or school or workplace, what we're all talking about tonight is how do we organize and build power in all those places? And it can happen anywhere. And that's why this victory is such a lesson and inspiration for all of us. So I'm going to let the rest of our panelists introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about how this strike inspires them and connects to the work that they're doing. So I'll start with Jane, and then Astra and Carmen, if you can jump in.
Thank you, Kang and Maria and Juana. It's just an incredible, I mean, I'm inspired because of the direct action that you took. I'm inspired listening to you talk about understanding that there was a choice of sort of individual, you know, action. You could have filled those forms in, right, way back months ago to like collect your individual rent, but you made a really different decision, right? You got together, you organized, you talked. I think Molly said something that was really interesting too, which was like that because Maria and Juana and people like you were actually already organizing the Tenants Association, you could actually imagine something different. So I'm super inspired because having built a tenant union almost 30 years ago through a trade union movement on the other side of the United States, and defending against the demolition of a lot of housing at the time, like 6 gigantic buildings of housing that were going to be torn down. Like my adult life is like waiting for the tenant rights movement and the worker rights movement to finally just marry. And you're sort of doing it. You're showing us, you know, a path forward. And so it's a pleasure to share a stage with Maria and Juana and the strikers. And I'm Jane McAlevey, and I'm really happy to be here. And we are overdue, right, to like mix debt, rent, labor, productive, all the ways that we can like jam and should be able to jam a power structure that is decidedly really against us. And if we can't do it in this pandemic and coming out of this pandemic, you know, it is time to strike, as they say. So I'm super inspired by your actions. And I hope that this sets off a whole series of events like it across the country.
Thanks.
Right.
Before we move on to the other panelists, I just want to pause and make sure that I saw in the chat that there's been some confusion on the Cantonese line. Has that been worked out? It's all good? Are you giving a thumbs up because it is?
I think Danik checked. I think we're
okay. Great. Okay, great. We can move on. Sorry about that.
Hey everyone, my name is Astra Taylor. I'm also, like Jane, just so inspired and happy to be here. It was really wonderful to hear about the strike from the inside. Thank you, Maria and Juana. there's so much here. I really feel like I'm amongst comrades. So the Debt Collective is a union for debtors. The seeds of it were planted in the 2008 financial crisis, where we had this thought experiment. What if mortgage holders had been organized before the crash, so that people who had subprime mortgages could have demanded write-downs from the federal government instead of the banks getting bailed out? And here we are, as Molly said, in a different crisis. History doesn't repeat itself, but we see precedents where instead of the big banks getting bailed out, we had astonishing federal spending on corporate debt, companies like Exxon and Walmart, and these roundabout bailouts for creditors, the landlords, as we discussed here, but also the fact that people's stimulus checks, on average, 30% went to pay down debts. That's a bailout for creditors. The creditors should have taken a haircut. So this is a manifestation, I think, what is so exciting about this, of this vision of debt as leverage. And one of our slogans at the Debt Collective has been, individually, our debts overwhelm us, but together they make us powerful, right? That together our debts can be used exactly as we're talking about here as leverage. So we have been doing that at the Debt Collective. Mainly, we're known for our work in the student debt space. We have been pushing for a student debt jubilee, but we're also working in California in collaboration with lots of people here on this call, I hope, on something called the Tenant Power Toolkit, which is an attempt to address something Maria raised, which is the way that what we're offered is these individualized means of sort of disputing our debts or trying to get help that don't teach us about our power. But the truth is we need help, right? And we deserve relief. So how can we provide resources to get people the aid they need, while also making clear this is a collective political struggle, and that we can, if we get organized, which is going to be the phrase, if we get organized, we can win so much more. So I will put that in the chat. Thank you so much, y'all.
Thanks, Astra. Carmen. Let me unmute you there.
Okay, can you hear me now? Thanks, great. My computer is kind of frozen there. The participant window is open. But anyway, hi everybody, I'm Carmen Lee, and I'm a service worker at the University of California in San Francisco. And my union, AFSCME Local 3299, we represent service workers and patient care workers across the state of California, like the VTA is now representing tenants across the state of California. So I'm super inspired to be here today because of the courage of the VTA strikers. And I really feel that it's a fundamental to one's security to have a home and a job with good wages and good benefits. So I'm passionate about those things, and AFSCME 3299 is dedicated to forming community alliances that address our members' whole lives. And like Jane said, the marriage between labor and tenants is super, super important. So the wins and the progress of the VTA and of my union show that when we come together and fight, we can certainly win.
Amazing. Thank you all. I'm so excited to be here with this panel. And so Kang and I have some questions for you all, and you may have questions for each other. We'd love to hear them. But I wanted to start by building a bit on that powerful thing that Astra said about that individually our debts overwhelm us, but collectively they make us powerful, right? That concept, we're absolutely seeing that as true in the work of the VTA and this debt strike. But I also know that the work to get there is not easy, right? And everywhere around San Francisco, everybody was trumpeting the message: you have to apply for rental assistance. Rental assistance is how you'll get out of this mess. This is how to protect yourself. And I I imagine that those conversations with your neighbors to get people involved in this strike were difficult. And so I want to hear from you, Maria and Juana, a little bit about what did those conversations actually look like? How did you move people from the experience of experiencing the debt alone as a burden to understanding the collective power and working together around your debt strike?
Just a reminder for folks to, with interpretation happening, to speak a little bit slower. I know it's so exciting.
Ok, una de la forma en que nos organizamos fue tocando puertas, haciendo llamadas, invitando a las personas a que vinieran a las juntas por Zoom. Hacíamos reuniones en la oficina de la asociación y muchas personas cooperaron, venían, dábamos nuestro punto de vista, pero más bien viendo qué podíamos hacer qué cosas podíamos hacer mejorando para lo de la huelga, porque eso era nuestro punto, ¿verdad? Poder hacer que Veritas nos cubriera al 100% con el alivio de renta. Y una de ellas fue haciendo eso, llamando, haciendo meetings y muchas personas apoyaron y estuvieron con nosotros aquí por Zoom y por las juntas, y más bien también yendo a visitarlos, pidiéndoles que nos apoyaran para poder ganar esta victoria. Y aquí están los frutos.
Salíamos también, como dijo mi compañera María, salía yo con Lena a tocar puertas, llenando unas encuestas. A base de esas encuestas podríamos obtener sus números de teléfono para seguir, como a decir, el procedimiento de estas encuestas que llenaban, para seguir invitándolos a que nos sigan apoyando con esa huelga. Y pues sí, era un poquito difícil, pero pues teníamos, como dicen, para tener un fruto hay que hacer el esfuerzo. Y sí nos costó, pero ahí estábamos. Todos los días salíamos a tocar las puertas. Y a base de eso, pues nos ayudó mucho tocando las puertas y pues llenando las encuestas. Eso también ayudó mucho.
Y también me gustaría compartir algo también. Aquí Juana y cuando la otra persona con la que salía a tocar puertas, hubo una ocasión también que las agredieron y tratar de ayudar a las personas que se unieran, porque muchos pues estaban con el miedo de pensar que podían desalojarlos. Entonces el propósito de nosotros era poder decirles que no estaban solos, que había una asociación que estábamos tratando de luchar para que Veritas perdonara la renta. Y mis compañeras en esa ocasión sufrieron este ataque por uno de los vecinos que se molestó porque no quería que se les diera esa información. Entonces, fueron muchas cosas, como dice Juana. No fue fácil, pero estamos contentos de que se ha logrado el propósito de cuando se empezaron a hacer las reuniones de poder ganar esta huelga. Y como dije al principio, ¿verdad? Ahora se está viendo los frutos, y no nada más por parte de nosotros, sino de todas las personas que estuvieron apoyándonos, y les damos las gracias por todo ello.
Thank you. That's so inspiring and such a good reminder to us. We see the dramatic action, we see the strike, we see the civil disobedience, but we also need to see the work that you, Maria and Juana, did door knocking every day that bore that fruit, right? also want to ask this question to Astra. How do you organize people who have debt? And how do you use debt as a leverage? And how do you assess, okay, here's where I could have power in this situation. How do I make it happen?
I wish I could give the definitive answer, but I think that's why we're here learning from each other, because there's actually so many ways to organize around debt. One point I try to make is that debt is not its own issue area over here. Like, oh, we have other things we care about, and here's debt. Debt is woven into all of the movements we're already part of. Debt is a housing issue, right? As I said, how do we get access housing under the economic system we're in? Through mortgages or through paying rent? And when you have back due rent, that's debt. Your mortgage is debt to the bank. Education is increasingly debt financed. That's why we've organized student debt strikes and are pushing the federal government to cancel all student debt as a matter of economic and racial justice. If you care about labor rights, debt is a form of wage theft, right? Because essentially you are underpaid at the job, and then you have to borrow to make ends meet, and you're charged interest and fees. So you're robbed twice, first by your employer and then by the lender who you are forced to go to, so that you can have healthcare, you can have, so your kids can get an education, or you can. So it's there in everything that we're doing. And so the strategic possibilities are very diverse. And I should say too, that our public schools are indebted. Our K through 12 elementary, middle, and high schools owe $500 billion, with Wall Street acting as an intermediary. Our municipalities, our cities are indebted. So there's so many ways to get into this. And I just want to say how much I admire the strategy that you all set upon by withholding your applications to this program. And this is why it's so important that we get organized, so that when an opportunity arises like that, we can take it. We can take advantage of it. Just like we were imagining, what if mortgage holders had been organized before 2008? We need to do that hard work so that we're ready when the next crisis hits or the next opportunity comes. So I really admire that. So I think the strategic interventions are always going to be different. It's different for the Veritas tenants than it is for student debtors who are targeting the federal government, for example. But our strategies on a human-to-human level are similar. We have to talk to people. So the stories of door knocking, of talking to people about their debt, their shame, their power, political education, engaging the media, reframing things, right? And saying, hold on, actually, it's not the debtor's fault, right? Maybe actually the person to blame, maybe the entity to blame is the landlord, or is the Department of Education, which is indebting students. So shifting the narrative. But all of those are the tactics of organizing that we have to deploy. And so in that sense, debtor organizing is a lot like other kinds of organizing that we do, right? It's helping people, it's not empowering people, it's helping people recognize their power. And I always feel like Jane when I say this, but working people cannot afford to leave power on the table. And that's why we have to mobilize around debt, because our debts are someone else's assets, right? They're on the balance sheets of entities. They're held by investors. When we pay our debts, they are a form of wealth transfer from struggling working families to the investors who hold those debts. And so I'll give one more quote from the Debt Collective. We like to quote the industrialist J.P. Getty, who said, if you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. But if you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. And the Veritas tenants showed that by saying, this is now your problem, landlord. And so, this is, again, reframing our burdens as power. Right now, renters in this country owe, some estimates on the lower side are $20 billion. So what if we see that as a form of leverage, as somebody else's problem? But we only get that, we only get there if we get organized. And so that's why this is such an inspiring and important story, because it's creative, it has a hard work, it shows that if you work long enough, we can win. So thanks.
Thank you, Astra. There's so many fruitful things here, and there's some great questions in the chat as well. I wanted to turn it to Carmen for a second to hear from you. And there's two things. There's a question in the chat about overcoming fear and what that looks like. And I'd love to hear you reflect on that in the preparation for strikes that you've done, organizing in the workplace. And I'd also, I think in particular, want to highlight one of the reasons why this is a panel that is a cross sector. I think it's very easy for everyone here to say, wow, the Veritas tenants did something so amazing, but that doesn't apply to me because I already applied for rent relief, or I don't have any rent debt, or I don't do tenant organizing. And I think what's so important for us to take away today is the lessons in the building of power that we all need to be doing in order to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that Astra is really naming. So can you talk a little bit, Carmen, about your organizing practice and what connections you see as someone who organizes unions in the workplace between this, your work, and tenant organizing? And you're muted again, so we'll have to unmute you. You might have to accept the request.
Okay, great. What I see education as being a huge piece to this whole thing and similarities. It's so important to educate union members about like convincing both groups, tenants and workers, that one worker alone is vulnerable and one tenant alone is vulnerable. Housing is a human right and it's essential for survival. Just like wages, healthcare, and good benefits and retirement are essential for the well-being of a worker. So what I'm trying to say basically is that without a job, you can't pay rent, and without a stable place, a home, a foundation, you probably aren't going to be able to keep a job. So one tenant confronting the massive wealth and power of a corporation like Veritas, and one worker confronting the wealth and power of the entire University of California system, this can be a super, super scary thing. So the fear of retaliation by the boss or the landlord can definitely be an obstacle to getting people involved in unions. So as an organizer, helping people, the tenants and the workers overcome the fear of being evicted or fired is super, super important. And one of the ways that I've experienced and that I've seen with the VTA to help lift them up and support them is when the workers or the tenants march on the boss, right, with a specific issue. And so I had the pleasure of marching with the VTA strikers months ago. And as they said, as Juana and Maria stated, that we marched on the Veritas headquarters at One Bush in San Francisco. And we were just asking them to come down and talk to us, right? And they refused. And people ended up getting arrested at that. So as a worker, we do the same thing. We march on the president. We've marched on the president at the university. We've marched to the houses of the regents of the university. And regents are basically the big guys who basically are in charge of policy making at the UC. The University of California, and we've also marched to the heads of departments and presented our issues and had the workers and the tenants did present the issues. So what happens, it's just so amazing to see the tenants and the workers, their faces light up and everything because they're so supported in this environment usually. So the issues exposed, the press is usually there. Other tenants and coworkers are there, and of course the boss is there. So they all get to hear this, and this whole thing is exposed, right? So instead of the worker or the tenant becoming a target, they're being noticed. But at the same time, because there's so much community involvement and the press and all that involved, it helps lift up the worker. It helps lift up the tenant and sort of keep them safe. Safe around, presenting these issues in fear of being retaliated against. So one of the other things, the last thing that I want to say about this is that an organizer's challenge is keeping union members and tenants engaged after the initial crisis. So in the case of the VTA workers, it might be winning the debt relief. And in the case of workers, it might be winning a contract, a labor contract. So I feel like it's super important for tenant, especially the tenant union members, to really to continue to use their hard-won rights, and force management, or the landlords, like we force management, to engage in bargaining and talks, even when there's no particular issue. So coming together with the boss just to discuss the mood or the temperature or the or what's going right, what's going wrong, even if we don't have a specific issue. So keep it present and continue, get them used to talking with us, right? I feel like that's really important. And what happens when we do that? Two things happen when we do that and continue the dialogue and the communication is, one, they know that we're paying attention and we're going to continue to pay attention. And finally, that we ain't going nowhere. So that's it for me. Thanks.
We definitely aren't going anywhere, and we're gonna here to make some noise. I mean, $32.99, I just really want to shout you out because you've really taken on organizing as tenants and as workers. Like you said, Carmen, you were marching with the Veritas tenants. One of your leaders was arrested with the other Veritas tenants in the civil disobedience. Your president, Catherine Leibarger, spoke at that rally, and you've thrown down for helping to win tenant right to organize. And this brings me to you, Jane, actually, because I think a lot of inspiration for us at Jobs with Justice is about thinking about whole worker organizing. And I remember reading the Stamford, Connecticut organizing wins back in the day, and it really opened my eyes to thinking about, wow, you know, how do we organize workers who are tenants? How do we organize tenants who are workers? And both at the sort of personal level there, but also what does it mean for labor unions and tenants unions to get together? What can we do if we bring those forces together?
And win more, right? I mean, Maria and Juana have kicked us off on like how we win, and Carmen has continued that theme in terms of 3299's work in the University of California and beyond. But the more we organize, the more we expand the base, the universe of people who are like in our movement, the more we're going to win. And yeah, I'm incredibly inspired and excited by what you're doing with the Veritas strike. But I also feel like, you know, I want to set our ambition to like when our tenant unions and our unions, but in particular in this case, when our tenant unions, you know, have more power than the California Realtors Association, like that's our next challenge, right? So we can go city by city, but actually when you think about that bailout that was given, you know, the sort of the preemption of the local law and then kind of the bailout that went from the feds into the pockets of the real estate industry, it's like, we know we have more work to do, right? So this is a great start. And I think I think part of what was so great is Maria and Juana showing, right, that debt could be power. And the creative use of the tactic was really, really sharp. So that's one. But two, you know, I feel like we learned a lesson early on in Connecticut, right, that led to the building of a pretty substantial tenant union. And the lesson that we learned, this is 30 years ago, I feel like I'm really dating myself now, but like when we began the organizing campaign, you know, we were organizing childcare workers, janitors, taxi cab drivers, right? It was a whole slew of workers, healthcare workers, and we won some initial victories, right? We were just doing, technically we were starting sort of straight up worker organizing campaigns. And we thought we were doing pretty well. We were winning $1, $2 an hour raises. I mean, that's a substantial heavy lift of a raise, right? When you win that kind of raise. And then suddenly we were like mowing down some trade union victories, looking at workers sort of as workers, when the city announced this giant quote unquote revitalization plan, which, you know, as soon as we read the fine details meant they were going to tear down every single unit of rent control, rent stabilized, subsidized housing that all the workers lived in. And so there was this moment in the campaign where we said, well, you know, what good is the union at work if you win $1 or $2 an hour raise, but you lose your housing, like you're gone, you move out of the city because you're displaced, as we take inspiration from the name of the Anti-Displacement Coalition. So, you know, it was not easy, as I've written about. There's a lot of struggle to sort of get all of the traditional trade unions to get the idea 30 years ago that we had to build tenant unions and we had to build worker unions, and we had to erase the wall between the two. And that as we began to do the door knocking in the big public housing developments that were all slated for demolition, Hope 6 projects, like I had to learn a ton of new language about housing and tenant work that I didn't even know the vocabulary when we started to do it. We just knew that suddenly a bunch of workers who had just formed new trade unions were about to all lose their housing. And that was going to be like the come to Jesus moment. We were not, like we were going to fight to the end, you know, to not let an inch of that housing get demolished, which is the success story in the end. It's all still standing. And we won more subsidies for it by having trade unions campaigning together with tenants. So what was the epiphany? I would just say, we began to systematically chart every single relationship. Like if we were talking to workers at work, we'd say, where do you live? We started to make visual maps of where every worker lived. We sort of knew it from going on the doors, like house calling workers. But if we're having a worker conversation, we'd say, well, where do you live? And if we were having a conversation knocking on the doors in the large housing developments, we'd say, well, where do you work, right? So we were doing reverse, what I call reverse and mutually simpatico charting to understand all the relationships. And then there was the next question, which was, you know, are you and your family a member of a house of faith, right? Do you attend a church, mosque, temple, synagogue, charting those relationships? So we began to explain to people, the more you understand all the ways in which you interrelate and connect in the broader city or the broader region of the community, the more points of leverage you have against the power structure. So I think the big issue is sort of erasing the incredibly siloed movement we have, which has come up already, right? But it's our job to erase the silos in the progressive movement for us to see and imagine the real power that we have. So I think being systematic, really understanding that each tenant, each worker, you know, workers are tenants and tenants are workers, generally speaking, right? So why the separation? Not sure, but I think it's our obligation to really systematically organize, which means understanding and then helping connect people's connections together and helping connect the issues together. And I think that's at the heart of it, right? To me, there's never been a separation between debt, climate justice, housing justice, language justice, worker justice. And that's the challenge, is to get out of our silos and to understand that power resides in our collective ability to make connections between issues, because it all comes back to the same set of 1% bosses. And that's our challenge, is to overcome them. So discipline, method. I love listening to Maria and Juana talk about door knocking and one-on-one conversations and phone banking and Zoom meetings. And I like kind of the way that you framed, you know, it's true that what people see is always our victories, our direct actions. We don't get to those direct actions without the hard work of organizing and a lot of one-on-one conversations and the discipline and the method of doing it. So that, to me, that's the end the silos, begin to understand that when a worker punches the clock and goes home, they go to a neighborhood. Well, what's the neighborhood? Where do they live? Private housing, public, what is it, right? And then connecting the dots to the power structure, because often, you know, the boss on the third shift that's oppressing you is connected to the landlord that's oppressing you in our power structure. And if we take them down in either one of those arenas, we're taking them down in both arenas, right? So that's I think, our immediate task about power building.
Thanks, Jane. I think that's a great segue to a question I have for all of the panelists. And before I ask it, I just want to invite all of the participants here, and there's so many of you from all over. I'm so excited. We've seen a couple questions in the chat and we're tracking them, and we want to start to open it up for more. So if you could drop any questions you have for our panelists in the chat, we have folks who are monitoring the chat to pull some out to ask. But while you all are doing that, I'd be curious to hear from the panelists. Building on what Jane just said, can you talk a little bit about what lessons you think this strike, the successful Veritas Tenants Association debt strike, has to offer for our organizing in an ongoing way? I see Astra getting ready to to unmute. Go ahead.
Okay, should I jump in? I mean, so many, lessons. I think, again, this idea of resisting the individualized approach of being sort of picked off and pushing into a collective mode, because that's the framework that the power structure Jane just highlighted wants us to be in, right? To stick to this idea that we've got to, apply for relief and it keeps us atomized, it keeps us alone. So I think that's a huge lesson. And again, it doesn't mean we can literally do the same thing in every context, but it's something to shape our thinking and to learn from. I also think, the one thing that the strikers mentioned was the question of these corporate landlords growing. And that's daunting because our adversaries are getting bigger, but that also means the targets we're up against are concentrating. So that means more people can be united against them. So there's, that's I think an important opportunity too. And then I guess, putting front and center the fact that we shouldn't have to treat our housing like a speculative asset, which I think is one of the powerful things about tenant organizing and organizing around housing justice, is it really actually kind of gets to the heart of the American dream and how nightmarish it is for so many people. So just want to throw that out there.
Thanks.
Can we take a pause real quick and check on the Chinese interpretation? Tammy and Kai, are things going well there? Or if other people want to jump in the chat, just check on how's it working.
Okay, it's good now.
Good? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think you're good to go. Sorry.
Great, thanks. Did any other panelists want to add on to what Astra offered? But we also have some great questions in the chat. In particular, we see a question from the Los Angeles Tenants Union, specifically for Juana and Maria to talk. It says that they'd like to hear about the meeting with Veritas that eventually happened. So I think this is getting at what did negotiations look like with Veritas? What goals were you going in with? And what did it feel like to be in that meeting? What surprised you about it? And maybe I'll add to that and just, can you talk a little bit about what your strategy was in approaching, how did you get Veritas to the table? I think we've heard a lot of that through your debt strike and actions, and then what was on the table once you were there?
Creo que nuestra estrategia, fue de que pues se dio cuenta de que por más de que nos mandaba, por lo menos de mi parte, de la parte de la señora María y de otros compañeros, mandaban correo electrónico diciendo cuando es lo que la deuda ya llegó, tienes que meter a la aplicación para la ayuda por el Estado, volvían a llamar y llamar. Se dieron cuenta pues de que como que no les hacíamos caso de lo que estaban diciendo. Creo que pues como quien dice, pues tuvieron que decir pues no nos van a hacer caso por más de que le mandamos cuánto es la deuda que tienen, por más que les llamemos por teléfono. Pues yo pienso que fue eso como que se tuvo que entrar en una negociación. Y eso fue nuestra meta que pudimos cumplir, de que no nos dejamos llevar por los correos electrónicos del que ponían la deuda y mucho menos por la llamada que nos hacían, aunque como que era un poquitito frustrante porque cada vez que te llaman y te dicen cuánta deuda tienes, pues uno, pues sí, de mi parte lo pongo a pensar, pero pues no me dejé. Ahí estuve hasta ahorita.
Bueno, para mí creo que lo más importante fue el no aplicar para la deuda, ¿verdad? Al Estado. Creo que eso fue lo más importante, en que cada que se hacían las reuniones estábamos todos de acuerdo en decir no, porque éramos un equipo, teníamos que estar de acuerdo. Entonces, aunque Veritas todo el tiempo nos estaba presionando, como dice Juana, mandándonos emails, dejando papeles en nuestras puertas, tratando de intimidarnos para que nosotros aplicáramos, pero lo que nos mantuvo fuerte fue el decir, no vamos a aplicar para el alivio de la renta. Creo que eso fue lo más importante que nos llevó hasta ahorita a ganar esta victoria, en estar todos unidos, en decir, no vamos a aplicar y no vamos a caer en el juego de Veritas. Entonces, eso fue para mí lo más importante, en estar unidos, en decir no. Cuando se tiene que decir sí, es sí, y cuando se dice no, es no. Entonces, eso fue lo que nos llevó a todos nosotros en la victoria que ahora todos estamos contentos de haber ganado, ¿verdad? No nada más cuando decimos todos, porque somos muchos los que hemos ganado esta victoria. Y una de las frases que me encantó de Astra fue de que si nos organizamos podemos ganar muchas cosas más. Eso es increíble, es una gran frase que debemos de tener todos en nuestra mente, de que si somos unidos podemos lograr, como dice, muchas cosas más.
Absolutely. I feel like everyone here, that is the top thing that inspires us. Astra, I saw you had a question. Do you want to ask it?
Yes. So in the planning conversations and reading about the strike, I learned that you all were talking about what you called shadow debt. And this is really important because we see this in other realms. So I was wondering if you would talk a bit about it. And how, for example, it made me think of how so much of what we call credit card debt in this country is actually healthcare bills, people putting their ambulance rides, their emergency room visits on their credit cards. And so I thought it was really interesting. I'd love to hear somebody talk about that.
Maybe Maria and Juana, you can talk a little bit about shadow debt that you or your tenants had to deal with.
Bueno, cuando decimos deuda de sombras, nos referimos a cuando hay personas o inquilinos pagaron con sus cuentas de ahorros, pidieron préstamos o estuvieron aplicando a tarjetas de crédito, más bien, ¿verdad? O en el banco pidiendo préstamos para poder pagar su deuda de renta. Entonces, a eso era lo que nosotros decíamos deuda de sombra.
Gracias por la explicación.
Es un placer.
I see another question in the chat, which is, can you talk about the win of the right to organize here in San Francisco? And there's a link because this win just happened on Tuesday. I mean, it's been years in the making. I remember going up with Housing Rights Committee members to Sacramento when Senator Durazo was trying to do this at a state level, and finally brought it all back here to San Francisco and had a vote at the board, 11-0, unanimous, in favor of the tenant right to organize. And, you know, a bit about the rights it gives is like the recognition of a tenants union, the ability to go in and knock on doors for organizers, and the forcing the landlord, like the struggle here, right, to get Veritas to even meet, like forcing the landlord to have to meet and discuss like living conditions, rent, habitability. So that was a big legislative victory that came out of an organizing push. I don't know, does anybody else want to comment on that? Jane, you have something? Yeah.
It's just so inviting. I was going to make this comment earlier about lessons, but I think it really relates to this point too. You know, when we win legislation like that, or when we win a union contract, either legislation or a union contract, it's a piece of paper. And what it takes to enforce a piece of paper is a powerful organization, right? So one lesson to me is what you've won, what you've achieved, both in the strike itself, which was like immediate victory, right? And super exciting, right? The work that Maria and Juana keep describing, the hard work of organizing and creatively changing debt into power, as opposed to debt, you know, shame, which the rich love to do to people in this country. So, but I think that a real lesson is, on the one hand, great measure of the power of the strike, that it led to an outcome like legislation, you know, but when we win a tremendous union contract, the very first thing, or, you know, within a week or two, the boss turns around and tries to punish us somehow, right? And they try to make, they try to nickel and sort of dime you after you have a big victory. And so the organizing can't stop. In fact, it has to continue, and it has to grow. First of all, because we need that law passed statewide in California, and then we need that to be federal legislation, right? So the way we're going to get there is to keep organizing. But the real lesson is we can't stop. We can nap, we can take a break. I always say after a big victory, you can take a break for, you know, a week or two or three. But the more people who are involved in the organizing, the less individual burden there is on each individual actor, right, in a strike or an organizing campaign. But the key lesson is, you know, when I'm working with workers, I tend to start out in the beginning by taking a union contract and either burning it, if it's safe, or ripping it up in front of them. And I say, this is what the boss thinks of the law you just passed or the contract you just passed. Because unless you can enforce it, it's not going to mean that much, right? So that to me is it's like a really, since we're making analogies to the right to organize or right to housing, you know, negotiations in parallel to union law, it's a lot of laws, but unless we enforce them, they're not meaningful, right? And enforcement of every law is about powerful organizations forcing the enforcement of the laws that we win. So that's my main, I'm excited about the law. But since we already have a lot of those laws guaranteed, quote unquote, guaranteed, you know, under labor law, we know that it doesn't matter unless the workers are strong enough to force the boss to adhere to the law. So you're going to have to hold their feet to the fire by building even more of a strong tenant union and union movement in the Bay Area. It's very exciting. That's all.
Thanks, Jane. I think that's a perfect invitation for the VTA to talk to us about what are the invitations for us to support the implementation of this win, right? How can we back up this victory and make sure that Veritas really does come to the table around the shadow debt like they committed to, that they really honor their commitments? What do you all have planned next?
Sí, bueno, estamos pidiendo que nos apoyen. Vamos a tener una reunión el próximo miércoles en la calle Primera Bush y la Market. Estamos pidiendo que por favor nos apoyen, que asistan para poder seguir con nuestra asociación pidiendo apoyo para las personas que sí pagaron su renta, pero tuvieron que pasar por esa deuda de sombra, ¿verdad? Que muchos perdieron sus trabajos y aún así pidieron dinero prestado, acabaron con lo último de sus ahorros y estamos pidiendo ahora que Veritas se comprometa. Ellos se comprometieron a que iban a ayudar a estas personas, que se iban a sentar con ellos para ver cuáles habían sido sus problemas, a pesar de que estaban pagando la renta. Entonces, es por esa la razón que estamos haciendo y pidiendo el apoyo para que estas personas reciban por lo menos el 50% de lo que pagaron y ellos puedan también poder pagar todas sus deudas que pudieron acumular todo este tiempo pagando su renta. Entonces, sí los invitamos que asistan es en la calle Primera, Bush y la Market, y va a ser a las 4 de la tarde. Están todos invitados, por favor, si pueden pasar la voz a otros inquilinos para que puedan estar ahí con nosotros.
Si puedo decir algo al respecto. Mi nombre es Juan. Es la primera vez que asisto a un video chat de esta clase y me he dado cuenta de que pues personas como yo, que como dicen, que han estado pagando a base de sus ahorros y tal vez prestando dinero. Me imagino que no soy solo yo el único que está en una situación así. De hecho, he estado averiguando un poco con respecto a eso y me he dado cuenta de que hay muchas personas que pasaron por la misma situación que yo. A lo mejor en el principio es bien difícil tomar una decisión y decir, ok, pues voy a tomar parte en esta cosa, ¿no? Pero cuando uno ya se mira, como decimos allá afuera en la calle, a palitos, es cuando empieza uno a tomar decisiones de las que arriesgándose tal vez con un poco de miedito, que lo obliga a que no lo haga. O sea, se anima y no se anima, ¿verdad? Entonces, pienso que muchas de las personas que están pasando por la misma situación que yo, de alguna manera se van a ver beneficiados con esta nueva proposición, digámosle. Tal vez no es proposición, sino que es una ayuda. El logro que ustedes han hecho, pues va a beneficiar a muchas personas, como en mi caso. Y yo creo que tomé la decisión correcta al unirme al grupo. Tal vez, como dije al principio, con un poco de miedo. Pero sí, ¿cómo se llama? Me gustaría que las personas que tuvieron que prestar dinero de alguna manera solo para cubrir la renta, pues que se unan, ¿verdad? Que no tengan miedo, que el beneficio es para todos, ¿verdad? Y pues yo sé que de una u otra manera todos vamos a resolver nuestras necesidades con la ayuda de la asociación, ¿verdad? Gracias por el tiempo.
Thank you, Juan. And I feel like a lot of people echoed that. I saw somebody else say in the chat that, no, people are not the only one with that. And I think that gets to this pivot that people were talking about, where there's like individual shame versus coming together and finding out that you're not alone and that you can do something together and turning it into collective power. And that's exactly what folks did, which is amazing. And that applies to so many situations in the workplace as well, where like, am I the only one being disrespected? Am I the only one being underpaid? Am I the only one not being able to get even the minimum wage? So that's the story of this collective power. So on that note, our last question for you all is, what are the next possibilities? We have the Veritas actions. I see people are going to be there turning out next week with you all. I'm sure people across the country can, retweet those images and pictures from the awesome action you're going to have. And for the rest of the folks, what are the next flashpoints? What are the next opportunities you see to build working class power and to build renting class power?
I'm going to jump in because I don't want to be the last word. But I do want to say that we know that rents have gone up on average nationally by what, 17%, 18%, 25% is the statistic where I am in the last year. This is untenable, unlivable, and is, a national crisis. And so I think, in that sense, this is the movement we need. These are the things we need to be discussing. And it's something, I think, to go back to that idea of housing and the American dream, that we also need to push forward a discussion about housing as a human right. This is not news to this group, but that we need to absolutely transform the way that housing is accessed and get that bigger idea out into the mainstream and in the national discourse. I know it's a small example, but for me, just being part of the movement to cancel student debt. In 2012, we protested. We had the first protest saying, cancel student debt, make college free. We have all of the newspaper articles of them mocking us and saying that, it will never happen. That will never be a realistic demand. The government will never cancel people's loans. We've won billions and billions of dollars of debt cancellation to date, and we're coming for all of it. So we can really, we need to push those big, bold ideas that people, they laugh at you, whatever it is, they ignore you. You organize, you organize, you organize, you organize, you organize, you win.
Thank you. We're coming for you. I like that. Carmen, Jane, and folks in the chat too, please share what's your commitment coming out of this? Where does this inspiration lead you? Where are you going to put in your efforts? Whether it's an action next week or anything else in your city.
I just someone just went to it in the chat, and for me, it's like the next step is we really have to figure out how to tax corporations and the rich in a way that we haven't done in a very long time. Because so much of the pushing, so much of the medical debt, so much of the debt that's going in, that's becoming the shadow debt, if that's the language that we're using, right? So much of that is because of the excessive power of a very small elite in this country, for whom we really should be handing out, the proverbial pitchforks at this point. And I think they're getting nervous, and I think that they should be, but we are far from being able to tax them yet, right? Sometimes I joke, if we could just go back to Ronald Reagan's tax structure, right? That's embarrassing to me that under Ronald Reagan, if we think way back in the Wayback Machine, right, the corporate tax rate was significantly higher. So I think at the root of a lot of this, right, is that we need more power. That's why we have to get out of our silos. That's why we have to see the connection between all the issues. And the connection between all the issues are people. It's just human beings, right? We are the connection between the issues. We have polluted water, lead paint, shadow debt, crappy jobs, bad bosses. It's all the same people at the top. And so building the kind of power that's going to let us retax super rich people and retax corporations is the power that I think that's where it's got to go. In terms of the ultimate work, is to just eliminate all this debt, right? I mean, that's the jubilee we need, is to forgive a ton of debt. And I know that I'll just close by saying that I've just obsessed in the last few weeks by looking at a series of polls, and anyone who knows me knows that I'm not necessarily a big fan of polls. I like organizing in one-on-ones and talking to people instead of polls. But the polling on canceling student debt at this point is off the charts. It's literally like how Biden possibly stands a chance at holding the House or the Senate, or the entire future of the country right now. In some ways, electorally, in part, rests on, do the Democrats just get it together finally and realize that canceling student debt is going to be the biggest, all the polling is saying it's the biggest motivation for why people are going to come back and vote in the midterm elections, right, which are just super important. So I think it's gone from an impossible demand in 2012 to it's the overarching reason why there's an enthusiasm gap right now among quote unquote Democratic Party voters when they're looking at the 2022 election. It literally comes down to this issue. If Biden would keep one significant promise. This is the one that families across the entire country say would create a huge relief in their lives. So we know that that's the beginning. Shadow debt and the cancellation of rent and shadow debt in the Veritas is like another just extraordinary example of this, and we have to keep it going. And I really applaud Maria and Juana and everybody in the Veritas Tenants Association, housing rights, anti-displacement, all of it. Like, keep going. Great work.
Carmen, do you have anything to add?
Gracias.
Tenía una pregunta. Amita, una miembro de la colectiva quiere hablar. No sé si es el momento ahorita, pero ya tiene rato con su mano levantada.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Me da mucho gusto de estar aquí escuchando y quiero felicitar a cada una de ustedes y a todas las que nos hemos dado el tiempo de estar aquí. Mi nombre es Amita Morales. Soy parte de la colectiva de mujeres representando a las trabajadoras del hogar. Para nosotros es muy importante saber que nos estamos organizando en algo como lo que es vivienda. Dentro de nuestras comunidades hay muchas necesidades y ahorita durante la pandemia estamos viendo cuántas personas, aparte de ser positivas a COVID, aparte de tener otras enfermedades como diabetes, como cáncer, están también siendo desprotegidas en cuanto a lo que es bien. Me parece muy bien en que nos organicemos y que es tiempo de pelear y de unirnos para que seamos escuchados. A nosotros, durante el tiempo que hemos estado en la colectiva, hemos hecho marchas, hemos peleado ordenanzas municipales, hemos ganado últimamente lo que es la SB 321, porque también las trabajadoras del hogar han estado muy desprotegidas. Entonces estamos aquí, gracias por darme el tiempo, por escuchar mis palabras, y estamos con ustedes apoyándolas. Pues nosotros traemos un poquito de nuestro conocimiento, ¿verdad? Y aprendizaje en todo esto. Y como mujeres trabajadoras y luchadoras, estamos muy de acuerdo con lo que es vivienda y seguir adelante y unirnos. Gracias.
Thank you. I've seen so much La Colectiva members. Yeah. And they have been building power and making big wins, winning paid time off for domestic workers, making sure that workers aren't excluded. So big victories there as well. Well, one last piece, actually, besides your own commitments to organizing, being able to like get into this exciting moment around student debt organizing, you know, getting out there, continuing this fight for Veritas tenants, being able to organize, use the tenant right to organize, not let it just be a piece of paper, as Jane said, that we just tear up, right? Like, let's use it. Let's be on those picket lines with 3299 and other unions. I just was at an action today. Like, there's real fights that we're all going to go forward and do. And this is a way of building power. And then the last small piece is we have an evaluation form. And I know this is maybe not this is like the ongoing work that bears fruit later, but we need to learn from each other. We need to evaluate, we need to keep going. And so, you know, take a couple more minutes to fill out that eval form. If Danik or Brad, you want to share that with folks. And, you know, I'm so excited to be in the space to learn and grow and organize with you all. So thank you.
Thank you all for being there.
Thank you. I'm dropping the form again. Yeah. You all want to come off mute and just say.
Thank you so much for having me and for everybody for sharing their stories and for the learnings. And I just want to say we're at the Debt Collective, we're so excited for future collaborations with everybody, with labor, with housing, with domestic workers, with environmental activists. So let's do this.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of strikes coming up. So I just think I just want to build on what Kung said. We know the grocery store workers are going to be up next, like the West Coast. There's going to be a lot of workers who were called essential workers who were sick and dying, frankly, on the very front lines of feeding people and keeping grocery stores open during this pandemic. And there are huge contracts up and down the West Coast. We saw the first strike in Colorado with the King Scoopers, but that's going to be one of the big strikes coming up. And I hope that everyone is ready to support it. And you just know that among the grocery store workers, we know it informally from talking with them, right? A ton of them are carrying shadow debt and rent debt, right? The percentage of income that a grocery store worker in California is putting towards their rent is off the charts insane. And Astra mentioned those increases. So every time we see a strike, whether it's Veritas Tenants Association on strike, or whether it's grocery store workers on strike, or whoever's going to be next, like, we have to all start supporting strikes and strikers to collectivize the movement and, again, take the wall down between us. So really happy to be here. A pleasure to hear from Maria and Juana directly, and Jobs with Justice and 3099 and anti-displacement housing rights. All the work that you're all doing is fantastic, and we're happy to support it in all the ways that we can.
And thanks again to Maria and Juana. You guys inspired us to get together. So shout out to y'all.
Gracias. Sí se puede. Sí se puede. Sí se puede.
Sí se puede.
Gracias.
Sí se puede. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Bendiciones.
Gracias. Gracias.
Buenas
noches. Nos vemos.
Sí se puede.
Bye.
Se
Thank
puede.
you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Buenas noches a
todas.
Gracias.
Buenas noches.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Gracias.
Buenas noches a todos. Gracias por la invitación.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Hey, Danik, I think
Thanks, panelists. You guys are awesome.
Slate where I am. This was awesome. Really impressive. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Stay in touch. Okay, bye y'all.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Danik, the eval form needs.
Yes, it's fixed. Brad fixed it.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And I will send it out to everyone still.
Yeah.